So this is the start of the first HypOps Fox-2 in about 4 years. And welcome to the show. My name is HypOps. I'm still getting used to that. I run the channel and created that Finland versus Russia video, which is probably why people are here. And I'm hoping to host more of these Fox-2s because there's a lot of missing context in that video. And I see a lot of the comments mentioning the fact that there's a lot of stuff that I didn't match to say in that 30-minute video. There is a lot of simplification and oversimplification, and I hope to address that here.
Okay, well, if I go second, my name is Tommy, and I am from Northern Finland, and Mr. HypOps found me from my channel in YouTube, where I was making videos and producing content about the then ongoing Finnish replacement fighter program for F-A-18. Since that, obviously the F-35A has been picked, and even the first one's been delivered from December on, but still nice to get around. Thank you.
Excelsior?
Yep. So yeah, it's good to be back to another Fox-2. It's been quite a while. I am a former engineer at a defense contractor. Used to work on drones. Thankfully, not drones that are relevant to this scenario, so easy to talk about. But actually, now I don't work for a defense contractor anymore. I'm now an applied AI engineer, which has also now become very relevant due to like the news about Anthropic and the Department of Defense and all that stuff. And so I'm really looking forward to chatting about this video.
Adam?
All right. I am Adam. I'm actually just a paramedic and a hobbyist. I just do some occasional OSINT. Yeah, I mean, there's not really much to it. I'm happy to be here. Know quite a bit about integrating like air to ground as part of a cohesive force, but yeah, just do a lot of research.
And our other moderator, Pellaeon.
Yeah, I'm just a moderator here. I high school admin and science teacher, so anything that touches biology I will be an expert in, but outside of that, not much.
And so let's get started. Does anyone have any initial impressions on the video itself?
Well, let's see. I mean, the video itself, I think the most obvious thing is just it's been very interesting to see sort of like how much the video was grounded in 2022 reality, and you don't really notice how much has changed since then until you get like a throwback like this video, and then you're like, wow, like warfare really has changed in so many ways since then. So that was like the first thing that I just felt so strongly watching the video.
Yeah, so about that, a lot of these comments I hope to address in part 2 and part 3. When I first started writing the storyline for Finland versus Russia, it was a few weeks after the start of the Russian-Ukraine war, and I was looking at the Russian Air Force and the Russian rocket forces and just trying to understand their capabilities. The initial concept of the video, I think I mentioned, was to explore the Russian ballistic and cruise missile performance. And this video grew out of that. It grew in scope quite a bit and at least partially explains why I've been missing these last 4 years or so. But much of the video has been plotted out, even though only about a third of it has come out. I feel quite embarrassed that only the first part has come out because one of the main points is to address some of the more recent innovations. Like I've planned to add in additional systems and the additional things that we've seen in parts 2 and 3. And it seems like it will still be a few months before I address those comments. Like I had added a part about drones at the end, which I hope to address some of the recent innovations that have come out regarding drones.
Yeah, I mean, the main other just 2 high-level things I noticed was, I mean, number one, obviously the lack of drones. The other one was, that we spoke about a little bit earlier before we started this thing formally, was that the Russian air forces were fighting pretty much like a Western air force. They weren't really following their doctrine at all, which in some ways explained the pretty negative results for them in that scenario. That's another thing. And then third is, we really do need to discuss some of the new technologies that would be online by 2030. So there's a lot of artificial intelligence things, and which are going to be having really significant impact by 2030. So those are like the main categories of things that I felt like I wanted us to chat about.
Yeah, so In the immediate next section, when I add in the Russian 5th generation Su-57, I start off by commenting that the way I had depicted how the Russian Air Force fought in coordinated mass formations is not something that they've demonstrated. Like, it's much closer to how Western powers envision using their Air Force to fight these battles. And so, like, the difficulty actually ramps up for the Finns across parts 2 and 3. Like, in the first mass engagement with 4th generation fighter, I forced the Russian aircraft to fight more of a Western style, something which they've never really trained for. Like, they don't fight in mass formations. In Ukraine, I think, we've not seen more than 8 aircraft operating in combination. It takes a lot of training to fight in large coordinated formations with different aircraft doing different jobs. Some fighters doing air superiority, other fighters doing strike, others running different types of EW support. That takes a lot of practice and training. And based on what we've seen, the Russians have not been able to do that.
I mean, that's definitely an important aspect. And it's also on top of that, the fact that a lot of Russia's, defensive counter-air is sort of designed to work within their own ground-based air defense system. Like, they have to be very integrated. But in your scenario, you basically had the Russian Air Force pushing way ahead of their front lines to basically have them charge into Finnish airspace. And realistically, they would stay much further back, and they would kind of be like well within the range is covered by their S-400s and things like that.
Yeah, like, that's the other thing. Like, the role I have used the Russians for isn't appropriate, not for this first section. The Russian Air Force isn't meant to be like the primary striking arm. They're meant more as a supporting force for their ground-based mechanized forces, combined with their ground-based air defenses to help ward off Western aircraft long enough so that their mechanized fighting forces can do the heavy lifting and be the decisive action. And that, too, is one of the major things I need to mention in the next part, which is more than fair.
I also will say that a lot of these complex operations, I mean, there's a very good video that, I don't know if you guys know him, HypOps made about how much coordination it actually takes to deal with an integrated air defense. And I think that also will play into a scenario like this where they're actually trying to take that Air Force on the offensive, because I definitely agree, and I mentioned this in the pre-show as well, is that an issue that kind of Russia's going to run into with this is that they're going to be trying to execute a strategy which works best when you are defending against a force that is using their Air Force a lot compared to when you're actually on the attack. And it remains to be seen on whether Russia could actually get their integrated air defense net far enough forward in order to actually be able to execute their strategy.
Yeah, I'm still quite convinced that there will be some initial elements where the Russian fixed-wing fleet will want to operate in front of their mechanized forces. It makes sense that they would start off with their long-range ballistic and cruise missile strikes and to follow that up with a window of time, perhaps a period of about several tens of minutes to maybe a few hours, where they will try to do some damage to Finnish command and control and air bases and air defenses. So I did say that they were primarily meant to aid the Russian Air Force, the VKS. The primary job is to support their ground forces in moving forward. But I feel like that this is also something that is necessary for an invasion attempt, that they will need to try to push forward and suppress the Finnish Air Force from operating and preventing them from hitting really sensitive targets, stuff like bridges and railroads, which will really slow down any invasion attempt.
Yeah, one of the big things that you also run into with this kind of scenario is that it comes down to casualties as well. Like, if you look at some of the casualties that Russia has been taking, a large part of that is because of the way that their doctrine kind of allows for the enemy to operate pretty freely, all things considered, while they're trying to get their ground forces to attack. So, what you're talking about here is how the Air Force is meant to be sitting with their ground forces. But when you basically don't capitalize on that, like you were saying, by actually pushing forward and starting to decapitate their command and control and their ability to coordinate, what ends up happening is that you now are fighting an organized resistance rather than a bunch of scattered elements trying to figure out what the hell's going on. Like, if you look at Desert Storm, one of the big things is that the first thing that they did was cut off that command and control. They completely annihilated their ability to coordinate and made it so like that way all these units are scattered trying to figure out what the hell is going on instead of coordinating an effective resistance.
I mean, I feel like to some degree, Russia's just not capable of doing that. So in some ways, they wouldn't try. I mean, they will try in the sense that, like, using Kinzhal air-launched ballistic missiles, they'll be using cruise missiles, a lot of ballistic missile strikes to try and take out command and control and those sorts of things for sure. And they will be striking ahead of the ground force with the air forces for sure. But just because they're striking ahead doesn't necessarily mean the aircraft are flying that much ahead. I think there'll be a lot of like glide bomb usage for sure, especially given how successful those have been in Ukraine, to sort of try and clear the path or soften things up ahead of their ground forces. And yeah, I think MiG-31s are going to be around waiting for any intelligence to sling a ballistic missile at a command and control site. I still don't fully agree that especially the fourth generation aircraft will be like trying to penetrate deep into Finnish airspace to attack command and control sites directly. I just don't think that's something they would be successful enough at. And I just don't think that's going to be how they try to play this.
Yeah, like when Russians are practicing, they have this Zapad or West practices every 2 or 3 years, I think. They usually, when the practice is in sort of north, their vision is that the whatever combination of countries they are going to fight here will have at least contested air superiority against them. It's distinctly different from when they are doing the southern practices. Then they always start from the assumption that they will have air superiority against Iran and whatnot. But otherwise, as their doctrine goes, they would want to start with decapitating the command and control system and with the mass use of special forces, and that combined with cyber and hybrid operations, so that you try to also destroy the will to fight in the country you are getting into. And as you mentioned, they want to operate pretty close to their own air defenses so that they are somewhat protected against at least pursuing fighters. They are quite hidebound, like they have the manual and they are expected to stick to the manual, unlike the Western pilots who are called to improvise very often. Try to keep in the framework, obviously, but still try to not to be too easy to guess what they're going to do.
Yeah, I think a good point that you brought up that we can talk more about is what's like the role of large enablers like AWACS and things in 2030. So we do know that like their A-50 fleet has been pretty chewed up and destroyed during the Ukraine conflict as well. I mean, I don't think you specifically called out in the video like how many AWACS you expected them to be able to field in the battle space. So I think that's something interesting to discuss, and to what extent would Finnish F-35s be able to take shots at destroying them, because as you said, like the Russian pilots are, very reliant on their ground controllers, or well, not necessarily ground controls in the space, probably like AWACS based controllers. And, talking about how well Finnish F-35s are going to be able to take out those A-50s will have like a huge impact on how the air war goes going forward.
Yeah, that's a pretty good point. I believe in the simulation, the Russians, they had 3 A-50s, they're AWACS planes, and there's always at least one running back and forth, trying to help coordinate their fixed-wing fleet. I believe 2 of them were destroyed on the ground or something recently by Ukrainian drone attacks. Was it 1 or 2? They've lost at least 1 that way. But that's also related to another point that I wanted to bring up. It's kind of why I had the Russians go forward, even though I did know it was quite a terrible idea. The F-35, it's just the best way to kill a stealth fighter is to kill it on the ground. If you're forced to engage F-35s in isolation, something has already gone terribly wrong. So this was an attempt at a decapitation strike. I remember reading, I think it was a CSIS report when they were simulating a Chinese invasion attempt on Taiwan 3 years ago. It noted that most of the stealth aircraft that the US lost were lost on the ground. I tried to incorporate an element of that, try my best to hit Finnish F-35s on the ground. And that was another point that other people kept bringing up, that Finnish doctrine is when war starts like this, they would use their roadside bases and try to stay ahead of Russians' ability to track and engage them. What I'm trying to say here is I took a really ambitious approach for the Russians that might have worked if Finland didn't have some of the recent high-end systems, their David Slings and F-35s. Like, what I tried could conceivably have worked, assuming the Russians could have coordinated their air force. I know that's a lot of ifs and buts, but I was trying to kill the F-35s on the ground, because once it gets to an air duel, it's a pretty miserable time for Red Force.
I feel like this is almost where we got to start talking about drones, because I think the large-scale loitering munition use is going to actually have decent impacts on the Finnish strategy of using dispersed roadside operations. In the time period when that doctrine was first developed, real-time surveillance was much more difficult. The ability to strike specific targets with precision, like in a distributed way, was not really as available to Russia back then. But imagine a world where in the first day of this operation, Russia also fires like 1,000 of their long-range loitering munitions, like the Shahed clones, which I shouldn't even call them clones at this point because they're actually much more advanced than the Iranian versions at this point. But, you could imagine those, like especially the ones that have sensor payloads and communication equipment, flying down Finnish roadways, or like specifically flying towards or looking at sections of roadway that are long enough and straight enough for distributed operations. It would be pretty high risk, actually, for the Finnish Air Force to just use roadways that are near the front, just because at any point in time, a couple of Garand drones with a sensor package that are being guided by an operator could just happen to come across one of their roadside air bases. It could happen. So it changes things quite a lot, I think.
Also, I mean, like, I would say, though, they also have to take into account, like, whether Russia could actually field that many of their more advanced drones. Because it comes back to their industrial base and their ability to actually produce them, field them, have enough units actually controlling them, and then, like, what the EW environment would also permit it.
I mean, their drone production is very healthy right now. Like, they're very easily, even today in Ukraine, to sustain, waves of over 100 on a given day. Like, they can sustain that with their production. Assuming that they were preparing for a war with Finland, they would have stockpiled things. Seeing like 600, 700, 800, 1,000 drones on day one would not at all be surprising or a shocking ability for Russia to have at that point, given their production capacity even today. As for communications, I think this is actually a very interesting thing to go into. We actually also have to talk a little bit about like the US loitering munition, like the Lucas drone. And I think the Lucas drone is like kind of like a very good view of like where the Russian drones will eventually evolve to. So right now, the Russian drones have to rely on very elaborate mesh networks, like trying to like hijack Ukrainian cell networks and all kinds of obscure like hacks to try and like maintain communication deep into Ukrainian airspace, because they don't have like this distributed satellite network. And frankly, by 2030, they're not going to be able to build one because their space launch capacity is in shambles. However, China right now is working on building their own like Starlink/Starshield clone, and it's very possible that Russia could buy access to that. And so imagine in a world by 2030 when like a Chinese Starshield like communication network clone is available, and each of those drones has like a phased array antenna on top. That's really, really, really hard to jam. And you could very easily end up in a situation where you do have those 700, 800 loitering munitions that all do have direct, relatively unjammed communication to their operators flying over Finland on the first day. And that's a pretty scary situation.
Yeah, this even affects the ground forces where I'm mostly in, and we used to use the so-called half platoon tents where you could fit 16 guys to sleep, and that's very easy to have a fire and stuff there so you can stay warm. But nowadays we are switching into separate lodging so that every guy has his own, not quite a tent, but basha thing, so that he can have his bedding there and sleep there, so that now you don't have one fat target of 16 people in one place, but you have 16 separate things, so that you can also like boost up the amount of targets there are and of emissions they produce, so that you can saturate the defenses with the drones. You can also saturate the drones with the targets so that there are very many. You seldom have enough sorties or enough drones to engage all of them.
Yep, that's a good point. I mean, I feel like that's somewhat a little bit of an easier thing to do when you're talking about individual soldiers like being distributed and stuff. Because yes, of course, you're going to probably be able to have more soldiers than you do have drones. But if we're talking about roadside air bases for F-35s or larger systems like tanks or other high value things like fuel storage, or it's much harder, I guess, to distribute that sufficiently to actually outcompete the number of drones in that way.
Yes, that's quite true.
My questions about Russia's future capabilities kind of tend towards the question of AI in production, because if they are using even Chinese bought satellite connections, will they have the ability to utilize sufficient technologies, whether that's AI or even just command and control links, to effectively target the Finnish aircraft? Or will, by 2030, even though it's only a few years from now, their technological capability have degraded significantly behind the West, that there's some sort of Western countermeasure that Finland would have access to help counter a cheap drone threat?
I mean, I think we need to talk a little bit more now about like how AI is even being used in the military right now. So if you look at the US military's like Maven program or like the recent announced usage of anthropic models, most of the AI integration right now is happening in the pipeline where you detect, identify, and engage your target. It's basically shortening the time period between detection and engagement. That's like its primary use case right now. So in many ways, that's less relevant for defense against drones. Like, I think right now AI models are not playing a huge role in how can we improve our defense. So it's like maybe a little bit less relevant from the Finnish side in this scenario, but it's super important if you're doing any kind of offense. And I guess it could actually be very useful for Finland as well, because one of the main jobs that the Finnish Air Force would have would be to try and attack the Russian ability to continue launching, Iskander missiles or attack their ground-based air defenses. And having access to this sort of AI in the loop capability to detect and identify targets quickly would definitely be a huge asset to the Finnish side in this situation. I mean, I think as far as Russia's own AI capability, like they are just so behind that it's not even close. Like we can almost take it as a given that Russian models or Russian AI capability is not in any shape, way, or form going to be even close to Western capabilities by then. Like the real question is, to what degree are they going to be able to use or to have access to Chinese technology? Because it is very possible that China is going to have similar capabilities to the West by 2030 or even greater. It's not impossible. And if Russia can access those, then, they won't really have an issue. But if they can't, I think they'll be in deep trouble.
So, I mean, I think that also goes back to like something that was mentioned in the video about kill chains. Is that like AI or not? The question is going to be whether Russia can actually adequately process targeting information to attack something before it can move. Because we're talking about like these fixed points and these fixed bases, but like as things start getting moved around and getting moved between areas, the question is going to be, in order to actually follow a dynamic situation where you're shifting between different roadside bases or et cetera, is going to be whether Russia can actually establish a kill chain, which right now they haven't really shown that capability.
Yep, exactly. But if by 2030 they do have the ability to integrate, like even if they only reach the level that the US is at today, I mean, right now we know that the US and Iran has actually had really good success targeting ballistic missile launchers and things across the country. I mean, you can see that with the rate of launches dropping. If Russia can even get to the level by 2030 that the US is at today with their kill chain efficiency, then it'll be a pretty dangerous situation for roadside dispersed air bases or air operations. So yeah, it's something that we can't know for sure.
I mean, it also said that's a pretty optimistic assumption because the US is operating off of like years and years and years of operational experience. Like you're talking everything from Desert Storm onward pretty much, where they have been establishing these kill chains, especially when you're talking about like global war on terror type of things, where you're dealing with a lot of very dispersed, you're not dealing with a bunch of big fixed targets. They're moving around all the time, and you have a very limited amount of time where any target is viable. And I think that those lessons learned really are making a difference in whether or not like Russia could even dream of getting to the point where the US is at today. Because that operational experience that the US has, the development that they have gone through, they would be lucky, like Russia would be lucky to get the capability that the US had in the 90s.
Yeah. I mean, like from a training and operational perspective, I completely agree. The real question here that we just have no way of knowing is like how much will AI's ability to accelerate the kill chain, how much will that progress by 2030? Like we really don't know. If it progresses enough, then it can to some degree compensate for Russia's lack of organizational experience in this area. And we also have to take into account the fact that the war in Ukraine is still going on, like they're still learning. Obviously they still have a long way to go, but I think it's still kind of up in the air what level they'll be at by 2030.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with you, but honestly, I wouldn't personally be incredibly optimistic about AI just because of the fact that from what we can see in a lot of how these models are working is you have to filter through a lot of things with how they currently work. They have hallucinations, they have issues identifying things. And when they're being applied to a real scenario, as opposed to like a benchmarking test made by a company that has an incentive to make it succeed, you start to see a lot of issues in these AI models. And without the ability to parse through those, that's really it could come to the point where the AI actually ends up hindering the kill chain rather than accelerating.
I mean, I don't want to turn this into like an AI podcast, but like I think you should be really optimistic about how much AI is going to be able to help especially by 2030. So for a lot of reasons. Number one, like these models are going to be extremely good and are very quickly going to exceed human performance on anything that you can like set up a verifiable reinforcement learning task for. Given the amount of money and incentive that there is to like set up these sorts of RL environments to train these models to be specifically good at this specific task, I have no doubts whatsoever that it's going to be incredibly helpful. I mean, it's already helpful now. I mean, there's been multiple sources saying that Anthropic's models have already been indispensable for the Iran and Venezuela operation. That's for today's models. By 2030, I have zero doubt whatsoever that you're going to have both Chinese labs and US labs putting together custom reinforcement learning environments to train their models in to be specifically good at identifying enemy systems and for making these sort of judgment calls. Yeah, there'll still be mistakes, there'll be hallucinations, and probably you'll still want human review as well. But given the fact that it's already greatly accelerating the kill chain, there's one source that I read, I don't remember if it was an anonymous source or what, but someone in the Maven project office already stated that for some of their kill chains, it's brought down the timelines from hours to minutes. So if that's the case today, by 2030, it's going to be even more so.
Yeah, I mean, even assuming if that's true, the thing is, though, is that also requires, like you said, human review. If Russia doesn't have that infrastructure, because we're talking about the U.S. military here, and I was talking about it before, about how they have these decades institutionalized experience where they are able to really parse through that a lot quicker and make that kind of judgment call very quickly, as compared to like the Russian military, who has not, again, demonstrated that capability. They haven't shown that they have a functional kill chain. And without it, AI isn't going to take a non-functional kill chain and make it functional. AI might increase the efficiency of an already existing kill chain, though.
I mean, I wouldn't call
and I think that's the biggest thing.
I don't think you can call the Russian kill chain non-functional. It's not good compared to what the US can do, for sure. But, we've had enough cases of Russia hitting useful targets that do move. Like, they have hit, not many, but they have hit some high-value systems in Ukraine that can move. And this is going to improve that. I mean, so it's not non-functional. It's just less functional right now.
We were talking about kill chains, and it's interesting to me how what we see in Ukraine and Russia, the initial improvements were actually from the lower end systems upwards. Like, it was the FPV drones operating on the front lines that were the first to have a greatly reduced kill chain. And it's quite difficult improving these kill chain times going upwards, like as systems get more impressive, going from $1,000 drones to multi-million-dollar ballistic systems. The Russian kill chain has improved over these past few years. I remember saying that initially it would take them a couple of days before they would send a ballistic missile at a SAM site where the SAM has long since moved. I believe like that is somewhat outdated, and I've heard somewhere that it's now down to maybe several hours. It still takes time to like get someone high up in command to like okay a strike with an Iskander missile. So there has been improvements that way. And we do see the incorporation of AI in the hopes that it would further improve these kill chains. And I'm reminded of, I'm shifting over to the Iran war, but a school was hit and something like 100 people were killed. And this is like a couple of days ago. And they're calling it an intelligence failure. And it sounds like the school was misidentified as something else. And there's even some speculation that AI would be involved in an operation like this. So like even for the US, this certainly isn't perfect. And
Yeah, I mean, for that specific school case, it wasn't even as much. I mean, it could have been AI related, but I think for that one, it was just more the fact that it was like a pretty tricky situation in the sense that that particular school was like attached right next to or kind of connected to an IRGC base. And so it was kind of like a more plausible mistake that perhaps even a human, someone working in the human aspect of the kill chain would also potentially make that mistake. I think an important thing to keep in mind as well is that the US is, generally speaking, I would say compared to Russia, probably more careful about what it is that it hits. I mean, even though the school situation aside, I think generally speaking, the US does try to take care in most situations to avoid civilian casualties. And Russia has made it very clear in Ukraine that they don't particularly care that much. So I do also think we got to consider the fact that Russia, if they have a sufficiently high inventory of a certain type of munition, like loitering munitions, that they might be totally okay with just launching a drone at absolutely anything that the AI identifies as potentially a useful target, regardless of whether or not a human reviews it as like, is that really a military target? Given Russia's activity in Ukraine, they might say, well, who knows, but there's a good chance, so may as well launch a drone at it just in case.
Yeah, and I mean, I could definitely see them doing that, but I feel like the other issue, though, is that they're going to get too many targets and they're going to get way oversaturated with the amount of munitions that they're going to have to expend to get even marginal gains.
I mean, I think this is like where we got to discuss like what we think their drone production is going to look like. I mean, right now it's already pretty massive. Like their production of loitering munitions is already huge. So we have to start discussing, like how long do we think they're going to stockpile before the operation starts? And another thing that's important to keep in mind here is that unlike ballistic missiles, these drones do not really need complicated launch infrastructure. It's not like you need an entire like mobile launcher like you do need for Iskander, for example, right? So if you have a massive stockpile of drones, it's actually much, much easier to like massively scale up your individual waves compared to what you can do with something like cruise missiles, which are limited by your air or sea launch platforms or your VLS tubes, or something like the ballistic missiles that are limited by your number of road mobile launchers. So that's kind of like another advantage that drones have over the other types of strike systems.
A big question for, not really me, I've seen this in the comments, is the optimism about Russia's ability to produce the number of advanced missiles and advanced planes. And I think this kind of ties into everything. Is it feasible that Russia will be able to produce advanced munitions and not rely on these low-cost, somewhat low-tech drones, which I believe they're using? You said, Excelsior, that they're using a significant number even throughout Ukraine. But are these high-end or are these the lower FPV?
They're not as low tier as FPVs. They're copied from and upgraded from the Iranian Shahed design. So they're kind of in the long range loitering munition class, I guess. Like, so they have incredible ranges, like in the hundreds or thousands of kilometers in some cases. They have significant warheads that you need to destroy meaningful infrastructure, but they are also much cheaper. So like we're talking about like $50,000, $75,000 per drone instead of something like $1 million for a cruise missile, for example.
I mean, also, wasn't there an incident where Russia was basically flying around other drones and claiming they were some of these more advanced drones?
Oh, I mean, yeah, decoys. They have specific drone types that they also use as decoys as well to just help saturate enemy air defenses. But their production of the real strike drones is very healthy, to say the least.
So for the higher-end systems, I remember looking into this, and I'm convinced that what I depicted with the cruise missile strikes, Russia will never be able to utilize cruise and ballistic missiles in such numbers. Well, not for any sustained amount of time after that initial salvo. A lot of the missiles that were used up in the Russian-Ukraine war were from their Soviet inheritance, and even now, their cruise missiles, they might be able to produce, like, for a lot of them, it's like a dozen a month. So like their stockpiles are so depleted that these mass salvos would be incredibly expensive for them. they are for sure supplementing with their drones. But most of the drones are lower end, and those are easier to defend, relatively speaking. And we see that from the West. There's a lot of reactivation of self-propelled guns, like lower end systems that were deactivated over the previous decades because they weren't useful anymore. But a lot of these drones that operate with just a basic propeller engine or gas diesel engine, these are well within the capabilities of like self-propelled guns to intercept. Of course, like there's higher end drones that can go faster and go further, like the Garan 5. But once you get high enough in capability, they start looking more like cruise missiles, and they are a magnitude more expensive than the lower end drones easily. So those higher end drones are still at least somewhat being limited by these factors.
I mean, the lower end drones have like some important advantages over even the higher end systems in some ways. So like the fact that they fly slowly is in many ways a benefit, because specifically those drones that have the sensor packages and live communication links, we've seen videos of this happening in Ukraine, which is a pretty deadly strategy, is that the drone's flying and it gets engaged by like a mobile anti-air team. Sometimes if that drone has the sensor package and live communication links, it will divert from its originally intended target and just directly attack that mobile air defense site. And we've seen videos of this from the Ukrainian ground perspective of like a Garan drone, like basically impacting like only a couple feet or a couple meters away from their mobile air defense team. And in many ways, this is like worst case scenario for Russia. They miss, but at least they will have definitely taken the attention of that mobile air defense site as it frantically tries to defend itself. And that usually will allow a bunch of other drones to bypass or continue on to their target. Also, once you have these like mesh communication networks, once a pop-up threat is like identified, all the other drones that are flying in that wave can be identified, and they can kind of like route around that. So yeah, of course, reactivating all these gun-based systems is very important. But we'll also definitely be seeing things like an mobile air defense site that's engaging targets, then suddenly gets swarmed by like 10, 15 nearby loitering munitions that just happen to be in range.
Well, I also said that's kind of an optimistic thing, because that goes back to Russia being able to coordinate large formations of drones and actually make them all coordinate together. Because, I mean, we were talking about this with the aircraft, but I don't think that, like, their capability to coordinate drones would be significantly off of their ability to coordinate aircraft if you were talking about like these large integrated strikes where you're having to deal with multiple layers of defense and you're having to integrate a large number of drones.
So I don't think I agree, because it's a very different situation for the drones and the aircraft. Because like for the drones, they're getting consistent practice almost daily in Ukraine. The kinds of air defense, ground-based air defense that they're facing in Ukraine are in many ways somewhat pretty similar to what they would face using these drones in other scenarios. They have constant practice. Their operational experience using large waves of Garan drones is like really good at this point. For the aircraft, it's a completely different story, because they're not coordinating large strike waves of aircraft in Ukraine. So presumably they won't learn how to do it. But learning to use the drones in this way, yeah, they're learning that pretty well right now, I'd say.
This sort of coordination is much more difficult for the defense to handle than it is to implement on the offense. Frequently in my simulations, it's the higher end systems like the David Slings, Patriots that first get the opportunity to shoot at something. And it is often quite tempting. I've got a specifier for it not to shoot at a lower end drone. You need profoundly good coordination with these self-propelled guns and lower end systems that can take out these drones, because yeah, it's incredibly painful to fire a $4 million interceptor against a drone that costs a few $1,000s. And
sometimes you still have to even do it, because I mean, we've seen in the war in Iran, there's been all those rumors and like suspected satellite footage of at least $200 million US radar sites being destroyed by those loitering munitions. And like if you have a Patriot site nearby, like guess what, you better fire that $4 million interceptor at the $50,000 drone if it's going to allow you to protect that $500 million radar.
And yeah, like that's exactly why a couple days ago, the US or some of the other countries involved with the current war in Iran, they were inviting drone warfare operators over from Ukraine because they have the best experience in balancing and mitigating these drone attacks. And for certain, the defense is on the back foot right now because it's so much more difficult to be defending against something like this.
Yeah, I think like an interesting thing to talk about is, as you said, you're going to cover this in the second part of the video, but we need to like discuss like Finnish offense as well, because, as we're seeing in Iran right now, like when you're doing theater missile and drone defense, you're defensive systems are not meant to be like a shield. Like you can't just like sit there and like absorb the punishment from incoming cruise and ballistic missile strikes indefinitely. The only way to win is you have to go on the offensive and do what the US has managed to do in Iran, which is like severely degrade the launch frequency by destroying launchers. It'll be interesting to see like to what degree can the Finnish Air Force survive the Russian air defenses and actually start to degrade their ability to launch Iskander missiles and cruise missiles and even these drones to some extent. Because if they can't, then it's going to be very difficult for any country to just continuously operate under pretty much a nonstop wave of one-way ballistic and cruise missile attacks. Because, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that the Finnish pile of offensive cruise and ballistic missiles is really that significant.
They bought a bunch of JASSM missiles, which work quite well in the simulations I've run so far. But that's a very important point, like I've been planning to make in parts 2 and 3. For the Finnish Air Force, it is a lot more difficult and bloody to go on the offense. SAM systems by themselves aren't that dangerous because once you identify them, you know the ranges, you know the limits of how far their missiles can go. They're like the passive element, like the walls. It's the VKS, the Air Force, in combination with ground-based defenses that makes it especially potent when they are attacked. And I can tell you right now, and I'm kind of spoiling the video, the 20-to-1 ratio I cited, it begins to go down quite drastically once they are forced into the Russian air defenses and the VKS gets to fight the way that they were trained to fight.
Maybe we can talk a bit about the Su-57 a bit, because I feel like we haven't talked about that yet. I mean, I think we probably all agree that the numbers of Su-57s is not realistic by 2030, but it'd be cool to see, I guess, what numbers do you think would be realistic? Because I think that really has a big impact on how they fight. Like if they have 12 Su-57s available, they're going to fight very differently than if they have 40.
It's tricky in that there's variants of them out there. There's the early variants, and they have, I think it was 10 to 20 of those, and they've been producing the Su-57M, like more modernized variants with better engines, better avionics, better sensors. And of course, they've been introducing their higher end missiles, their R-77Ms, which I called them K-77s, and apparently the name's changed now that they're operational. But we've started seeing them in limited numbers in Ukraine. Like I think it was last year, they found pieces of their new missile, which was fired by an Su-35S. But yeah, the number I cited, 72, is definitely way too high. Like I feel like even a single regiment would be quite ambitious. Maybe just a squadron of like 12 or 18.
On specifically the S-57, the M's still are not in production. The engines are still being iterated on right now. And so those improved engines haven't yet seen the light of day. And so it's kind of a question of how optimistic do you think it will be until those new engines get finalized that they can even start production?
I would not be optimistic with the way the Russian economy is going right now, because that costs money, that costs time, that costs development effort, and also, like we mentioned in the pre-show, like the brain drain as well.
Yeah, I mean, it really just depends on how we think the Ukraine war is going to go. If it ends this year, sanctions get removed in a peace deal, XYZ, then obviously they're going to be in a much better position to potentially do that. But if this drags on until, into 2027 or even 2028, then the idea that they're going to even be able to start something new by 2030 is pretty unlikely, I guess.
If you look at how the Su-57 has come on, they consistently miss the metrics. And we can look at the T-14 for this too. Their measures of when the aircraft are going to be coming out and how successful they'll be at manufacturing is just not what the claims are.
Yeah, it's absolutely been the case historically with a lot of these more modern systems from Russia. Before we get too much onto the topic of manufacturing, I'd also like to point out the other thing we were talking about, the offensive side, even on the defensive side, something that I saw in the chat that I think has kind of been overlooked because command doesn't model it very well, is Finnish artillery and making use of artillery systems to either help slow the ground advance and to help, depending on the range and positioning of those systems, they may even be able to help to
Tommy,
strike.
As it just happens, we have the good luck that Tommy is part of an artillery unit, correct?
Yes, that is true, yeah.
Yeah, so what are your thoughts on this? What have you seen? How are you guys preparing?
The normal brigade has 4 battalions, and 3 artillery battalions. And 1 artillery battalion is basically supporting 1 infantry battalion. And it's as it works is that in NATO context, usually the 1 battery is the firing unit with 6 or 8 guns. But in Finland, we used as a firing unit the battalion. That's like 18 guns. So it's quite gun heavy. And we like to use that a lot because that saves blood, because it's much like with Israelis, like Russians are not going to miss one music who has been done in Finland. You have to try to keep your forces intact. And what you said about the rocket artillery systems, they are really potent, and you get deep fires into the enemy rear with them. So it's going to be very, very useful. And altogether, like they have a common system where you allocate fires from all the way from the Air Force, if the target is sufficiently high value, all the way to sort of like your company mortar platoon with 381mm tubes. I'm not sure if they have gotten for example, the chaff rounds for the rocket artillery, which would obviously create screens so that the F-35s could cluster behind this falling chaff from the atmosphere and then start to make offensive or defensive moves behind that. But that's basically all the tricky in the book, because the English were already using it against the Germans in 40s. I'd say that everything binds so much together. And to keep it short, it's really the fires the Finns like to use in great masses to destroy Russian infantry and armor as well. So that the less our infantry has to fight, the better. You get much lighter casualties that way.
Could you comment on what does Finnish long-range MLRS procurement, especially the guided kind, look like going forward until 2030? I forgot, what specific guided MLRS do you guys procure?
There is the regular normal ones, but the guided ones, I think I would need to go to United States Congress pages because they give the numbers, but they were few tens last I checked the permission. So
is this for HIMARS?
Yeah, HIMARS. And so it's a bit of like a secret.
Got it. It would be interesting to see if, like, by 2030, you guys would have PrISM missiles for your HIMARS as well. I mean, as many of you may know, we got the first debut of PrISM in the war in Iran recently. So that's really interesting. I believe that missile has, what is it, like a 300 mile or like what, 400, 500 kilometers?
450 kilometers.
Yeah. 450 kilometer class range. And that's only for the first increment. The later increments are supposed to get longer range as well. So given the size of Finland, like 450 kilometers is like really a healthy distance if you guys end up getting access to that.
Well, I was commenting that it was a bit surprising that the JASM came into Finland before the F-35 was sealed, and of course before NATO. So it seems that at least US Congress and foreign policy has been happy with the things Finland has been doing. So I think we might get the PrISM missile when it comes online, but even now, how do you say, the mass fires are, let's say, for the ground forces use, but the long-range fires are very much for the Navy and the Air Force, so that, for example, the Åland archipelago between Sweden and Finland, Swedes put infantry brigade into the Gotland island, so now it seems that in the greatest peril is the Åland archipelago. So there it would be useful because you can use fires all the way from mainland Finland and you can still get whole island chain within reach. And
like PrISM Increment 2 has an anti-ship seeker on it as well. And so, if you guys had anti-ship ballistic missiles, then that would make a huge issue for the Russian Navy trying to operate in the Baltic.
Yes, but as you know, the Baltic is now pretty much a NATO lake, so they don't have very significant surface units, and I think only one submarine in the Baltic, so I think they have sort of written it off.
Yeah, and for the video itself, in part two, like I had a bunch of ships from the Russian Baltic fleet right beside the Kronstadt base near Finland. That would be a terrible idea. They're there because I wanted to explore some anti-surface warfare, and Finland has the naval strike missile or joint strike missile. I forget which one was the one that's mounted on aircraft, but that's one thing. I haven't even considered using the HIMARS for that, but they should be in range if there was any HIMARS near the coast, and that's further reason why they won't want to be there. But some of the newer Russian ships have fairly high-end anti-aircraft systems, so I wanted them there to help aid the ground-based S-300s, S-350s, S-400s to ward off the F-35 strikes. And your point about the JASSMs, yeah, like it kind of makes sense to me because it gives Finland options before the F-35 started arriving, because your F-18 Hornets can throw them at the Russians before the F-35s got there. And their range is so long that you could practically fire them from like over the Finnish bases if they wanted to. Although I'd imagine that they would try to launch them from some unexpected angle so that they wouldn't be seen outright initially.
Yes, and also depending on do you want to have saturation, how much you want to, and what you're trying to accomplish. So maybe you would want to coordinate with Swedes, like in this time frame or our time period, or what time string, let's say, like when
Yeah.
Finland and Sweden are in NATO. But of course, in the light of your scenario, it would be Finland more or less
In isolation, that's correct.
in isolation. Yeah, so that would affect the things a bit. So basically, I think that in this scenario you are presenting, it would be trying to get the narrow point of St. Petersburg bridges dropped so that you create the logistics nightmares for the Russians in there. Because as you pointed out in your video, that is really the attack lanes into an axis of advancement into Finland, and it's from south of the Lahti area, because that's really pretty nice tank country. It's fields, maybe some isolated forests, and quite a little rivers there, so it's pretty good tank country. So basically, Finns wouldn't want to fight there.
Yeah, I got some comments about that in the YouTube video. People were debating what was the most likely scenario and what would be the most optimal route. Optimal is a bad word because like all the best routes have been heavily prepared against invasion. Like it's either bad or more bad. It's all quite terrible, and the Russians, I think, hopefully understand this better than anyone, given the history.
Yes, and I'm sure they are aware of it, but it's pretty much like whatever they are told to try to accomplish. If you need to, for example, to get Finland capitulate quite early, that would maybe be the way to go, because there is good country for the Russian motor rifle forces, and it's good country for them, and there is not much natural obstacles you can build the defense. How do you say that supports the defense? So it would be a very hard fight. When you go a bit north, then there is the Lake District, and you can't get anywhere there. It's like a forest, big lake, another forest, big lake, very few roads. So you are tied to the roads. You cannot get mutual support from the different advancing elements. But yeah, what you have done, I think it's pretty much the most obvious and best ways to attack southern Finland.
I think one thing that would be interesting is to see if they would do any more ambitious air assaults, like we saw in Ukraine, like the whole like Hostomel assault. I mean, clearly that didn't go very well for them, but it's plausible that they may try something somewhat similar again.
I mean, you'll need control of the air, if only briefly, and it was why I attempted to shut down the air bases for a few hours, so that supposedly like something could be attempted, but it's difficult. And I remember in the video like plotting some Su-34s in to try to go after the air bases, and even with me turning off all the ground-based air defenses, their SAMs, their David Slings, because the missiles have all essentially been used up, they weren't able to get through the F-35s. Like that would be incredibly expensive and bloody. I can't see how they could even begin to hope to attempt such a thing when they don't have air control. With the Finns having such potent aircraft and missiles, like it would be suicide.
Yes, and as you pointed out, the Russian Air Force likes to fight preferably close to the, let's say, home turf, so that they are at least partially protected by their own ground missile systems. And even the Su-35, well, they can see, most likely they can see F-35 because they have this S-band or what frequency band radar, but they cannot get the kill chain going, because if they can't get the X-band radar to see the F-35, you can't get the targeting solution, which the F-35 should easily be getting. So you are in a back foot already in that.
Yeah, and CMO does model that. Like frequently you see something on the lower band radars that there's an object out there, but it's incredibly like imprecise. You might have like a volume of hundreds of kilometers, and the Russians would throw out some missiles, and the missiles would turn on their active seekers and hope to see something. And there was a lot of that in the simulation. A lot of the early missiles were fired, but the chances of them hitting were like, if I had to throw out a number, it's like 1%. Like they had to throw out like 100 missiles for one missile to like get lucky enough to spot an F-35 within its narrow cone of maybe 10 or 20 kilometers and latch on. And the F-35, the stealth works against that as well, which further reduces and degrades that. And so it becomes incredibly difficult.
It does. Even if you have these A-50s or the radar support, it'll definitely stay in the protective envelope of the ground-based air defense system. So they don't see that much from that far.
Yeah,
So-
like against 4th gen aircraft, they're very useful, but against the 5th gen aircraft, like they were really struggling. I've tested out scenarios of Finns trying to snipe a Russian AWACS, and the AWACS have to stay so far behind that they're essentially not useful if they can detect an F-35, and CMO puts it at like maybe 30, 40 nautical miles. They're like well within the range of AMRAAMs. They just struggle to be useful like that.
This kind of goes into a bit of the controversy around in the US about the AWACS replacement and like the E7. Because, yeah, I mean, I feel like everyone's realizing that as 5th gen fighters proliferate, you really just basically can't put a powerful enough radar on airliner type substrate to allow it to see, let's say, like a J-20 coming at you with like a massive long range air-to-air weapon. Like you're just not going to see it until it's too late. And so like the US solution for this is that there's a lot of investment happening right now in a space-based tracking of various things, both for ballistic missiles and also eventually for air-breathing targets as well. So like that's one of the more like further methods of dealing with this. The other is just like a far more distributed sensing layer. So using, in the US at least, using the CCAs to set up basically a sensor network, or networking all of your fighters together in a way that they can build this coherent picture of the airspace without an AWACS. And then, you know, if you do, like in the later part of the decade, start to get some of this like space-based sensing layer as well, then, you know, you really do end up in a world where AWACS start to become, to some degree, extinct. I think it's funny because, you know, every time a new development happens in war, people have an argument about like, oh, like when is XYZ thing like finally extinct? Is the carrier extinct? Is XYZ extinct? And realistically, as many people know, like military assets only ever go extinct once something else can do its job better, not just because it's vulnerable. So like the vulnerability of AWACS is not by itself enough to prevent them from being procured by militaries. What is going to stop them from being procured is like when these alternatives, like networks of drones generating battle space pictures or space-based sort of radar images of the situation. Like once that reaches a sufficient level, that's when you're really going to start to see large fixed-wing airliner-based AWACS really start to disappear.
From what I've seen, it really is drones that might be the answer. These like large radar platforms, the math is just so against them, especially now with a lot of aircraft are stealth and they're so power hungry. You don't see that in the propaganda trailers. Like you just see an S-400 a radar. You don't see that it needs like a massive generator behind it as well to keep it powered. It seems to me, and I've heard rumors that future AWACS planes will be assisted by drones, expendable platforms that will go forward and help the AWACS view the battle space. Expendable.
Kind of like where you have some of the early discussions of the B-21 radar being like a battlefield coordination node, which in some ways ends up taking some of the job of the AWACS. Because imagine like you have a B-21, this highly survivable platform that can be very near the front line of whatever battle's taking place. And then you have this like network of CCAs or other assets or drones that are generating this battle space picture. And the B-21 ends up being like almost like a command and control node where you can aggregate all that information and process it and have human input way forward in the battle space. And that's usually something that historically an AWACS would have been doing. An AWACS would have been sitting there using its own radar as well as all the information from other assets to put together and process and create this cohesive vision of the battle space. And yeah, B-21 is in many ways going to end up doing that, at least for the US going forward. Of course, this is very different for other nations that have not invested in these sorts of stealthy long-range strike platforms. Definitely, there's probably no chance that Russia ends up actually finishing its hypothetical stealth bomber program. It's just not really going to happen. So other militaries are going to have to come with like a different solution to this problem than the US.
Yeah, and in fact, Uni Island just pointed out that I think with Boeing, if recollection serves, are working on AWACS drone. And of course, when you think of it, it's not like the stealth airplane sucks the electronic waves out of the air. It's more like controls where they are going after they bound off the fin of the aircraft. So when you have a constellation of these drones, maybe one more expensive with the radar sending equipment, and then the cheaper ones with the receiving ends, you can more easily find the spikes where the stealth airplane is guiding the emissions, so that in essence you build one huge aperture for your radar.
Yeah, it's multi-static radar setup. And this becomes even more extreme if we do get to that world where we have the space-based sensing layer, because a very common design point you'll see for long-range stealth bombers, for example, the air intakes are on top, because, one reason for that is because, well, that shields them obviously from ground-based radars. But if you end up having radars lighting you up from space, maybe having the air intakes on top isn't really as much of a helpful feature anymore.
Yeah, and there's the feature that aeroplane needs to have wings, so you are going to have one hell of a large area reflecting radiation back to sky, so can't really have stealth against space-based systems, what I have understood from them.
I think it's kind of one of those things where going forward, stealth is basically becoming a necessary but not sufficient condition for survivability. It basically becomes table stakes going into the 2030s that you need to have it. It still provides value, but it's just by itself not sufficient. You end up having to almost fight fifth generation aircraft more similarly to like the way that you have to fight fourth generation aircraft today, where you have to kind of assume that you're visible to some degree. You're basically going to have to start assuming in the 2030s that you are more visible than you are today. And it doesn't make stealth not useful. It's still very important. It just isn't sufficient anymore.
Yeah, that's quite true. And talking back about the HX program, like every plane there is not, well, they are not stealthy or low observable, of course, but still they have cut down their radar cross-section enormous amounts from, let's say, from Phantoms and what have you, 60s, 70s, 80s time, like A7s and whatnot.
Yeah, it's interesting because, that's just like one property of how RCS works, is that with each reduction in RCS, you get severely diminishing returns, right? Like those little optimizations done to 4.5 generation aircraft where you just like reduce their radar cross-section by maybe like half or maybe by a quarter, like that already has like a huge impact. Whereas like if you try to do what the US has done, which is like pushing really, really deep into the stealth regime where you're trying to like minimize it as far as possible, it becomes exponentially more difficult the more stealthy your aircraft becomes.
Yeah,
It's been talking about the simulator again, but they've made strides reducing the radar cross section with stealth paint. Like they've added these features to a lot of recent 4.5 plus gen aircraft. But even a reduction of like, if they reduce their stealth by like half on radar, they might only reduce the range of detection by a few percent. It's quite difficult to get meaningful stealth performance improvements out of 4.5 generation from the fourth generation baseline, just because they weren't designed for that from the outset, and there's only so much you can do to reduce their cross section.
Yeah. So I feel like the one thing that we haven't talked about yet is I think you said that in the scenario, Sweden was providing some AWACS support, and we didn't see any, I guess, like organic Finnish AWACS capability in the scenario, if I remember correctly. How are we thinking about that?
There was. I just didn't mention it. They have the C-295 plane. It's the big looking aircraft.
Now I remember. That's true.
Yeah, apologies for my cat. But yeah, like there's a Swedish AWACS and like a Finnish AWACS constantly in the air, and they do help provide battlefield picture to the Finns. The simulator seems to think that their other radar coverage is already good enough with their ground-based Kiva 2010s or GM 403 or whatever they're called. But the AWACS also provide a more complete picture, and it's a bit more useful out further north in northern Finland. And they're assisting F-35s and F-18s that were fighting up there, but I just never got up there because of time limitations. But they were around, and yeah, I've only had the Swedes provide limited intel. Like these videos, it's backwards from how most people would have done them, I think. I started from wanting to explore missile strikes, so I was like, okay, what other country could they attack where I could explore some of these systems and countermeasures? And at the time, Finland was in a lot of the news. They still hadn't finalized their high-end SAM contract. At the time, the David Sling was still in contention with a few other systems. Like there was the Barak MX, and the Patriot also made a bid for it, I think. A few of the higher-end systems were competing for that contract. And of course, the F-35 had been confirmed. And so given that I wanted to explore these systems, and I wasn't comfortable going into Ukraine because stuff was already happening there, and it felt irresponsible because if I make something fictional, it doesn't seem right when there's real operations and real people dying there. So I picked a country that seemed plausible, maybe an alternative universe. And so that's how that gets started. And a lot of considerations aren't meant to be realistic. Like I put Finland by itself, isolated for scope reasons, and so I could continuously run similar-ish scenarios and then kind of reset. I make up a bit more plot to reset everything back. Like at the end of the video, even though Russia lost like 80% of its aircraft, that should immediately stop any operation cold for a long time. I said Russia doubles down. I just kind of reset everything. Like this time they're going to attempt it again with their 5th generation aircraft and a few more bells and whistles, because the plot is in service to the technology and tactics that really interest me, and that's how the priority works for me.
Yeah, one, I guess, interesting thing we could discuss is, so in the video you mentioned that the F-35s are Block 3F, which I think is the most realistic selection, but it is an interesting change from how we originally, I guess, thought it was going to be a couple of years ago, because I believe back when F-35s for Finland were first floated, at least some of those aircraft were initially expected to be Block 4 by then, and it's interesting to discuss how would this scenario have been different had the original Block 4 timeline stayed, and if Finland had Block 4 F-35s instead of the 3F?
The discussion, if recollection serves, was always about the 4th generation F-35s. And even with the Rafale, it was the upcoming 4th tranche fighters that they were talking about. So yeah, they were really talking about that. And the situation with the Swedish and Finnish and also Danish is that we have in Baltic common situation picture, and also air picture is the same. So basically, unless Swedes would decide for some reason that they don't want to give that information anymore to Finland, and they would pull the plug of the system, but in this kind of scenario, but otherwise the Swedes would see what Finnish radars see all the way in the east, and the Finns would see what the Swedish AWACS can see.
Yeah, I believe the Block 4, I'm not really sure how many of the new Block 4 capabilities would have been super helpful here. I mean, so if I remember correctly, Block 4 was going to have an upgraded radar. So that would be very helpful for sure in this situation, especially due to like the limited number of AWACS that can operate over Finland. Better radar on the F-35s would make a big difference, assuming that the Block 4 had been there. I think that Block 4, also like the software upgrades, would allow for much better passive targeting. So that would probably also make a difference. But I guess otherwise, probably wouldn't have actually had like too much of a huge impact on the scenario besides those two issues, right?
Not the ultimate result, but I think it would have had a pretty significant influence in that. So the aircraft were Block 3F in all properties, except I gave the F-35s the sidekick upgrade because I liked the fact that the 2 extra missiles, it was just prettier. That was the biggest reason. It also seemed like a compromise. I didn't give them the full Block 4, but 4 missiles, it's one of the biggest weaker points of the F-35, the fact that its munition inventory is so limited in order to maintain its stealth. Yeah, so like the Block 4 has much better cooperative engagement capability. The Block 3Fs, if you looked at them carefully, they still had to maintain their own radar lock on the Russian aircraft. And because of that, they ended up having to get a lot closer in order to fight. If they were on Block 4, they should have been able to just toss out a missile, and another further back F-35 should have been able to guide that in. And so the Russian aircraft probably wouldn't have been able to get that close that quickly. And the F-35s would just have been able to fire off the missiles and retreat in good safety. So it wouldn't have affected the ultimate result. Like, it would have been a more decisive loss to the Russians, but with the better sensor capability, it would have been a lot cleaner had they been upgraded to Block 4.
So just a question for you on kind of how things turned out in the simulation. What was the actual kill probability of the AMRAAMs? Like, do you know what they actually ended up achieving practically from the scenario?
Like, the simulation uses mostly PK math, so it doesn't calculate it exactly like how something like DCS would, where it models the exact pathway of the missile and the aircraft and sees if it registers a hit. It fires off a missile, and then like as the missile goes, it calculates its kill probability based on its speed, the speed and angle of the aircraft, the speed and angle of the missile. And there's a possibility of failure. For like an AMRAAM, there's like a 10% chance that the missile just won't work, that it would just not fire. And it calculates all these down into a percentage. The missiles start out at like low double-digit percentages at maybe 70, 80 nautical miles. Like, there's a hit probability of like 10, 15, 20%. And as you get closer and closer, that probability goes up. Once you get down to like 40, 50 nautical miles, it's closer to like 30%. And each Finnish fighter fires like 2 of them. And so at ranges of around 40, 50 nautical miles, a cell of 2 missiles will more probably than not hit a Russian fighter. The Russian fighters also have EW capabilities. They try to model the Kabinia countermeasures. Those are the EW pods mounted on Russian fighters, and those have a percentage chance of degrading and confusing the missile, which also affects that final percentage calculation. And as they get closer and closer, the missiles get more and more lethal. Yeah.
I guess one interesting thing to circle back to like drone related things. So currently in the Middle East, as the US defends against drones, a lot of that defense is aircraft based. So like we have F-15s with APKWS firing those very low cost laser guided rockets in huge numbers to take down swarms of drones. That is obviously not a good fit for an F-35 for many reasons. I mean, you can't fire those laser guided rockets from internal storage, of course. And we've also seen helicopters used a lot. I'm just curious to see, like, how do you guys feel the air-based drone defense would go for Finland in this scenario? Like, would they, for example, maybe assign their F-18s for low-level drone hunting? That might be a good choice, and leave the counter-air role for the F-35s. Or perhaps they might forego air-based drone defense entirely, but that would definitely reduce Finnish ability to defend against massive drone swarms.
Yeah.
For the video, there was a section which also got a little bit of flack because I had the F-35s intercept a limited amount of cruise missiles and explain why it wasn't so common. I should issue a correction. Like, it has become more common recently in the last few years. Russian F-16s have been doing it recently. Israel has been doing it recently against drones and cruise missiles as well. And they've been trying to adapt because firing an AMRAAM against a cruise missile is quite expensive. Like, if it's against a really cheap drone, it might be like 10 or 100 times more expensive to fire the AMRAAM. But they've been developing innovations there as well. Like, as you said, the APKWS, these mini rockets that are in volleys of 7, I think. And these have become more common as ways to deal with these low-cost drones and loitering munitions.
Yeah, it's
I
just
think
those don't integrate with F-35 internally, though. So that's kind of like why I was curious. Would we see maybe the legacy, the old Hornets being used primarily for the drone defense role?
I haven't decided. I mentioned before I'm splitting this into 3, and I purposely put the drone section last because I can take in all the most recent innovations, and I haven't decided yet, but it's conversations like these that influence what I want to demonstrate in that final section.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of touched on it, but like the thing about the APKWS is that I'd say for countering the drone threat, 5th generation fighters really aren't the ideal because they can't carry as many of these munitions that are particularly effective and cheaper. And like they don't really interface very well with the stealth in and of itself. So it would actually provide a very good use for those 4th generation fighters that they have, like the FA-18s, that they can use to help counter that drone threat. Also, like with the APKWS, I think it comes in 7. I think there's 7 pods, but I think there's also pods of like 19. There's like a larger pod as well.
I mean, we've seen coming out from Iran that helicopters are a really solid counter to those slow drones that we were talking about earlier as being a big threat. They're piloted, they're manned in a remote sense.
Yeah, I think the helicopters are an interesting point because in the current Iran situation, yeah, helicopters are incredible for drone defense when you have at least local air superiority around the area where you're doing that interception. Because obviously helicopters are very vulnerable to enemy fighters and things. I'm not really sure if Finland would be in that situation. I mean, imagine like you're a Finnish helicopter pilot and you're trying to like shoot down swarms of incoming drones somewhat near the border. You would be at really high risk of long-range air-to-air missile fire from nearby Russian fighters. So perhaps the helicopter solution would not be as favorable for a Finland situation as it is in the Middle East right now, or at least the helicopter would have to be kept really far back to maybe defend areas far further in the rear.
Helicopters would shine in protecting air bases or any targets that you really can't afford to lose. Because whether the helicopters are in the air or on the ground, they're in danger of getting destroyed by the incoming attacks.
Yeah, I can see a use for them as well. Further in the back, their slow speed and their ability to loiter and hover would be an advantage against threats like drones, say. But they would need to be coordinated well with the fighters and radars closer up.
Yeah, and I have seen the videos from Ukraine, for example, with the helicopters, but I think you could use basically any Piper Cherokee pretty much the same way if you have a guy with maybe shotgun would be the best choice if you can maneuver close to the drone and then you can blast it down.
Yeah, we've seen that in Ukraine as well. Yeah, it was those really old piston aircraft with guys literally with a rifle in the back. So it does in fact work.
We discussed about the roadside bases quite a bit, and yes, it's basically you need 800 meters of straight road where you can land and take off, and then you need some other road leading away from that place so that you can get the airplanes at least short distance away from the runway itself. But that's basically it. Like the airbase might have like a regular air place, let's say Rovaniemi, and then there is a few road bases close by. And then the maintenance guys, weapons guys, and whatever, they pretty much drive around with the trucks, or then you arrange it so that you go to place X to rearm. And of course, you can get gas there too, but if you need to have some kind of a preventive maintenance or maybe repairs, you go to a different place. And so that you try to swap around as much as you can. And when you are coming back to home turf, you go really down close to the ground so that you cannot really be seen, like where are you going.
This leads to another observation that keeps coming up in the comments, and something I've been trying to understand better myself. Up till now, the Finnish strategy has been dispersal, like up until they acquired the David Sling, they understood that they shouldn't even try to intercept the ballistic missiles, that they should abandon the larger bases, which are inevitably going to get hit, and stay dispersed onto civilian airfields and road bases. But buying high-end systems like the David Sling seems to be a pivot away from that strategy. It gives the option to attempt to intercept ballistic missiles to try to hold on to and utilize their air bases. So I'm kind of curious how they will be used, because it seems sensible to stay with this dispersal strategy, but like it doesn't synergize well with these big and bulky interceptors like the David Sling.
Yes, in fact, it's classified like how many battalions or batteries of David Sling they bought is secret, and also the amount of systems is secret. And of course, the range is such that it could be parked somewhere in, let's say, between Hämeenlinna, where the Patria has the factories for the AMVs, and Sisukars and Helsinki, so that it can pretty much protect both from one place. But these in the north, distances are such that I don't think it's very feasible to have enough David Slings to defend, let's say, whole of the Lake District, because there is hardly anything that warrants strike with ballistic missiles or cruise missiles. So if those are going to be used, you can pretty much figure out where they're going to land. Of course, the David Sling software is so good that if it sees that the missile or rocket is going astray so that it's not going to strike anything useful, they are just going to let them land.
Yeah, I think one important thing, though, is that the range of David Sling and any ballistic missile defense system depends a lot on what it's intercepting. Against cruise missiles, it obviously has like much longer range than against Iskander ballistic missiles, for example. So if Finland is trying to do ballistic missile defense, they're going to have to place the launchers for the interceptors basically right at or very close to whatever the object is that they're trying to defend. So it really does dramatically reduce your opportunities to have a single battery cover multiple areas that you want to defend at once.
Within the simulator, it's actually not possible because the missiles come in so fast and the interceptors have maybe 30 seconds or a minute to respond. And so it's not even possible to cover two bases from what I've seen. The effective range against ballistic missiles, if they were basically on top of the airbase, it gives them like a bubble of maybe 50 nautical miles, and that doesn't get even halfway to the next base. So I did mention that it's a very limited solution, but aside from these air bases, I'm struggling to justify where else I could put them, and only put 4 of them down because that number made sense to me at the time.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's a difference between what makes sense for your specific scenario versus a more real life, in quotes, situation. I feel like in your scenario, it does make sense because, of course, Finland would want to defend its most powerful and important defensive assets, which are its aircraft and the ability to keep them in the fight. However, in, I guess, a more realistic scenario, especially given that Finland has now joined NATO, presumably it would be much more important to preserve the ability for other members of the alliance to come to Finland's aid. And so I would imagine in a real world scenario, you'd see more things like David Sling defending ports, or maybe defending transportation infrastructure, or defending things that would allow other allies to bring in supplies rather than just directly covering the air bases.
Precisely.
I think, too, we're seeing, with helicopters being a good defense, that you can have a lot of drones act as counter-drone measures, especially if we're worried about costs of the interceptors. How easy is it to retrofit or create a bespoke drone to act as a countermeasure?
I mean, at this point, they'd probably just buy them from the Ukrainians. I mean, that's effectively what's being floated right now for, so a bunch of Gulf countries have already allegedly at least placed orders from Ukraine for interceptor drones to help in their current situation. I'm sure I wouldn't be surprised at all if Finland also ends up purchasing a lot of interceptor drones from Ukraine at some point.
Besides the issue of cost, another huge issue when it comes to defending against mass drone attacks is coordination. It's the higher end systems that get the opportunity to fire first against a swarm of dozens of drones. But you're trying to not do that, fire $100 million of missiles against drones that might only cost $1 million in total. And so you need to coordinate with the lower end systems, the self-propelled guns, the guy with the shotgun. And that is extremely hard to achieve. And I'm reminded of the THAAD that was hit, was it yesterday? That was hit by a drone, and I'm wondering what happened there. Was it simply out of missiles, or was there maybe some element of confusion or miscalculation there?
I mean, I haven't checked this, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that even would have the ability to intercept a drone even as a last resort kind of thing. I think it's just way too low down for that specific interceptor type, leaving aside how expensive that would be.
Yeah,
But
that
yeah,
is a ballistic missile interceptor only.
Yeah, but it would be very interesting to see what did in fact happen to allow that drone to get through. And it's very funny. I saw some commentary somewhere online talking about how, it's so interesting that we've seen some videos of U.S. service members just filming drone impacts, whereas in Russia we see a lot more, I guess, guys with AKs and various things spraying at the incoming drones, trying to mount a last-ditch defense. It's kind of interesting to discuss what it is. I think probably from like the US perspective, the reason why you don't see as many individuals with rifles and shotguns trying to take down drones in the last moment is mostly just because of how casualty sensitive we are. It's probably, given the current conflict in Iran, it's like much worse for the US administration to have one additional casualty due to like drone shrapnel or something than even losing $200 million radar or something. It's probably just like actually worse politically. Of course, in Russia, it's a completely different situation. Like, they'd much rather sacrifice 5 guys with a shotgun, even if they have like only a 1% chance of taking down the drone. I think it'll be very interesting to see like what's the geopolitical context for this conflict in Finland as well, because it depends on how existential is the conflict for Finland, right? Like if Russia invades Finland in the way that they're basically just going to annex the country and take it over, perhaps this might inspire a lot more high-risk defensive behavior, like dedicating, soldiers to actually try and provide last-ditch defense for incoming loitering munitions. Whereas if it's like less of a existential crisis, is more of a political or pressure tactic, then perhaps that wouldn't be the case. I think this is more of a internal Finnish political question than anything else.
Yeah, and I guess that's also something I want to remind the viewer of. All my scenarios are maximalist. It's always the most extreme situation. All the assets get used, and in real life, there are a lot more considerations for losing stuff. And it might be partly the reason why we don't see something like the Su-57 being used all that freely, because the fear of losing one and the blow to prestige, these things are considerations in real life, whereas they're not a consideration at all in my scenarios, and that's on purpose.
I mean, I'm not Finnish, but I would suspect in this situation where Russia's launching a massive ballistic wave, but drones held back later, the expectation would be a pretty significant invasion. And so I don't know, what would the Finnish armed forces response be? Would it be to push guys forward to chance a 1% interception over losing the country?
Interesting question. Well, first of all, you would just maybe have to see, like, okay, and if you have some kind of intelligence assets and you get some kind of inkling what's happening, then yeah, like, there's not much to do except fight. But of course, you cannot win by defending, so there would be quite frantic drive to get allies so that you can get some kind of a positive results, or at least not very negative results out of the fight. Yeah, it would be a very bad show, but I guess you would just have to fight and see. Alone, I don't really see that there would be a push towards the Kalibr area from up north. But of course, if you are thinking now that how depleted the Russian forces are right now, even something like that could be feasible in this time frame if you take into account how depleted the Russian armed forces are because of the Ukraine war right now.
Yeah, there's a lot of sensitive infrastructure as well near the Finnish border in Russia. So like obviously like their primary strategic nuclear submarine base up, I think, on the Kola Peninsula.
Yeah.
There's not that much infrastructure connecting that to the rest of Russia. It's very rough, harsh terrain, and it would be very threatening for Russia, I suppose, to see what amount of damage could Finland do, either via ground or just long-range strikes from aircraft, to kind of like sever that northern area off from the rest of Russia, at least logistically.
That one probable scenario, again, in this scenario, Russia tries to go for the maximum to like end a war in several days. The north is more sparse, and it would probably be a lot more practical with the Russian military at its current state. And I hope to go a bit more northwards in part 2 and explore some of the stuff up there.
Yeah, that will be cool to see. In fact, the old pact times, the axis of advance from the Soviet border from a little town called Salla and Kemijärvi ran pretty much next to the river Kemijoki, way to Kemi, like my hometown. And then from over there, Swedish side, over the NATO and Finns were practicing for the north. But right now, they really don't have the choose to pull something like that.
We're past the 2-hour mark. Would people like to finish off with their closing thoughts?
Yeah, that sounds good. I mean, basically just reiterating, it was really cool to see the video. Looking forward to the next parts. Definitely curious to see how drones end up being factored into the next pieces. That's kind of what I'm most excited for, especially given the situation in Iran right now. And yeah, that's about it. I'm looking forward to it. And thanks for hosting this discussion. It's been fun.
Yeah, with me too. I watched the video and it was really well. In fact, as a video, it was really cool, and of course the situation was very interesting to me, so I enjoyed it very much. And of course, one has to say that it's quite seldom that you get to discuss these things with knowledgeable and same-minded individuals, as I had the fortune of doing today. So I would like to thank anyone who was talking and also everybody who came to listen. Like, I have been looking the discussion board there, and there has been really, really good questions there. Thank you, and good night from Finland to everybody.
Yeah, it's been fun, guys.
I appreciate you having me on, and I'm interested to see if any of your thoughts or any of the discussions we had today will shape the upcoming video on how the drones are approached.
Yeah, that's why I left that section for last. I want to revisit this especially because a lot has changed these last 5 years. The video was started 5 years ago, and a lot of the innovations have not been accounted for. And I'm a little bit embarrassed because a lot of the questions I intend to address in parts 2 and 3. Part of the reason why it's spread out over segments is that I can start adding in these innovations, these things we've learned and are implementing these last few years. And I've tested a lot of the things that were spoken about in isolation in the CMO software, but not put it all together. That day is coming soon, and it's conversations like these that help influence what I attempt in the simulator, and it's good to hear everybody's perspective on what's been happening. So,
what I was going to ask, how far along part 2 is, and whether or not it would be possible to actually, because we briefly touched on like Finland's artillery capability, would it be possible to actually integrate that as well? Because I feel like that would start to degrade their ability for continued strikes once that initial waves of the invasion start. I feel like those artillery pieces would play a big role in whether or not Russia could continue strikes.
yeah, something like the HIMARS and attack and missiles, I hadn't considered utilizing them alongside the attacks, but I've tested out such systems in isolation. And a lot of the work was done in research and setting up the initial scenario. Now that all that's done, that's not something I had to do for parts 2 and 3. I have a pretty good idea of what I intend to show. Of course, when simulation day comes, it never goes quite as you expect. And you can see a really good example of that in the last video. I've mentioned to other people, I've run the scenario many times, and I know the approximate ratios of aircraft that's lost. Like, the Finns usually lose between 0 to 5 fighters in the air, and the Russians lose practically all their fighters, but some of them get out if they just launch their missiles and leave. But I've never seen a Russian 4th gen aircraft get within knife fighting range with the Finns, do a bunch of damage, and somehow still get out. That was something that was not intended. When that first happened on simulation day, I was like, I can't use this with how I had scripted it out. I should throw this out. But then I mulled it over the next few hours, and I decided that it still shows what I had intended, although in a slightly different way. And the Russians do manage to get a fight under their best circumstances. And that was not something that was initially scripted in, but something I had to work in. And I'm glad I did, because something like this, it is conceivable. Real life is messy. Unbelievable things happen. And when something like this happens in the simulation, someone else tells me that I should keep it. And I'm glad I did.
Yeah, I mean, no plans to rise to contact with the enemy.
Okay, that's a wrap. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Thanks to everyone who came. I'll make sure to link everybody's social media handles. I think I already linked Tommy's blog, but I'll also make sure to link everyone else, whatever they want. Thanks again for listening. Take care.